Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 153. The apple is miles from the tree. Izuku had been off ever since Thursday night. He'd hardly come out of his room all weekend, and despite trying to mask it, it was pretty clear that something was wrong. He'd been holding himself differently lately. He'd seemed happier. But of course, that was only obvious in hindsight because he was back to how he used to be now. He was still talking to his friends, though, so he wasn't completely isolating himself. Shota had been worried enough that he'd called the number that the social worker had left with them. She wasn't scheduled to come around very often anymore. She assured them that Izuku would be okay and gave them a few things to watch out for, but other than that, time was the only thing for it. A recurring theme that Shota did not like very much. He was admittedly a little lost in his own thoughts as he walked down the hallway, and it took him a second to process the voice calling out to him. "Ah, Aizawa! A word if you have the time," Yagi called from down the hall. He took a deep breath, reminded himself that Yagi was not his enemy, and halted his steps so that he could catch up. "Perhaps in private?" Yagi clarified in a hushed tone once he was within earshot. Oh, so it was about the case. He almost hoped that it wasn't big news. Neither he nor Izuku could take another hit of big news right now. With trepidation, he filed the two of them into a disused classroom. "I got word from the Chinese front. As far as they know, she is no longer in the country. As you suspected, she allegedly left on a flight to Korea shortly after arriving. I've yet to get word from any of my Korean contacts," Yagi explained regretfully. Shota had to hold back a sigh of relief. If Yagi had just told him they found her or that she was dead, he might have blown a gasket then and there. "All right. Thank you, Yagi. This is certainly a faster turnaround than I would have gotten." "Yes, of course. Anything I can do to help." "Is that all?" "No. Well, yes, in terms of information. I've noticed Midoriya, I mean, he's been a little off, and not that it's really my business, of course." "Spit it out, Yagi," he interrupted the other man's floundering. "Is he all right?" How the man before him was the same man who'd been masterfully playing the media with carefully curated speeches for the past 3 decades was beyond him. When Yagi wasn't all might, he was incredibly awkward and downright sheepish, or at least he was around Shota, though that probably had more to do with his own rather brash demeanor. The dichotomy was remarkably similar to Izuku and Ivy, which was a realization that prompted far more concerns than Shota currently had the capacity to spare for Yagi. Regardless of any of that, it was clear to see how much the man cared for Izuku. Adults caring for him had been startlingly sparse in his life, and Hizashi had told him how Yagi had been there for Izuku after the USJ. Shota really shouldn't be so critical of the man. He'll be fine. Recently got some troubling news. It's not my place to say what. I don't know how advisable it would be to ask him yourself, but I won't stop you," he replied. Yagi's eyebrows shot clear up to his hairline. The olive branch was obviously unexpected. "I'm going to pivot my efforts to his previous school's incompetence until one of us hears back from the Korean front. If you leave now, you should be able to catch him before lunch," he said by way of dismissal, and didn't wait for Yagi's reply before taking his leave. He heard the other man sputter a vague "thank you," but he ignored it. He had work to do. Requesting Izuku's school records would be far less suspicious coming from UA than it would be from the police. He didn't want to give them a chance to sweep evidence of their negligence under the rug before he got his hands on it. Toshinori wasted no time heading toward 1A's classroom. The bell was about to ring any second, and he needed to find Midoriya before he settled into the lunchroom. Pulling him aside was one thing, but walking into the busy lunchroom and picking him out of the crowd felt like a step too far. His worry spiked a bit when he heard the bell ringing, but he wasn't too far now. He could still catch him, right? Midoriya, my boy, I'm glad I caught you. Could we have a word? He called out when he spotted the familiar shock of green hair. Toshinori saw the way Midoriya cringed at his request, and part of him wished that he could take it back. He knew the boy well enough to know that he wouldn't say no to him even if he wanted to, and asking in front of his friends was even worse. He'd just been so worried, and Aizawa seemed to think that he might be able to help. Oh, sure, I'll meet you guys at the table. I have a packed lunch today anyway, he answered and dismissed the group. None of them looked very happy to leave, but they did, and Toshinori was guiltily glad for it. He had hoped to spend lunch with the boy, but he supposed that was as much of a dismissal as Midoriya felt comfortable giving. That was all right. He pulled the two of them into a disused classroom, like Aizawa had done with him not 5 minutes prior, and let his form drop before pulling two chairs away from their desks to sit at. Midoriya took the offered chair and started picking at his nails the way he often did when nervous. He clearly didn't want to be here, so Toshinori wasted no time in getting to the point. You've seemed down these past few days. Are you all right? He asked. Midoriya froze at that. He furrowed his brow in confusion for the briefest moment, like that was the last thing he had expected him to say. I, yeah, or, I mean, I will be. I don't even know why. Sorry, I'm fine, Midoriya stuttered out. You'll have to excuse me for not being convinced by that, he replied with a light-hearted chuckle. Midoriya huffed a breath out of his nose in an approximation of a laugh, but the grimace on his face betrayed that it was half-hearted at best. Sorry, he cut himself off with a quiet noise of frustration and worried at his lip before continuing. Did your, were your parents, what were they like? Toshinori was so taken aback by the question that he couldn't keep the surprise off his face. He was glad Midoriya felt comfortable enough to ask that of him, but he hadn't even thought about his parents in, God, must have been years. That was sad, wasn't it? Time had a way of distancing people, though. That's just how things worked. It had been nearly 40 years since his parents died, and he'd like to think that they wouldn't blame him for moving on. They were they were kind. They were good people, he said wistfully. There wasn't much else to say about them. Most specific details of their personalities had been lost to time. All he remembered was what they made him feel. Maybe it was nostalgia or rose-tinted glasses, but the memory of them made him feel warm and happy. Midoriya's brow furrowed again, but this time it looked more like a flash of anger. They didn't they didn't care that didn't have a quirk? He asked so quietly that Toshinori barely even heard him. The question felt like a punch to the gut. He had spent his whole life trying to ensure that no one had to suffer the same fate as him, that no little kid had to grow up like he had grown up. But here Midoriya was, having lived in the same hell that he had. For all the good he had done, for all the change he had fostered in this country, it would never be enough. It may be a new age, but people were still people. They still did the same awful things they always did. Oh, my boy, of course they did, but things things were different in my day. My parents had a lot more to worry about than whether or not their son had a quirk. He answered with a sad smile. Yeah, of course they did. Sorry, that was a stupid No, no, that's not what I meant. That's not a stupid question. I'm not, I suppose, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Things were just different. He trailed off lamely. He was botching this. On the bright side, it seemed as though Midoriya wasn't as against talking as he had thought he would be, but that didn't help so much if he had no clue what he was trying to get at. What brought that on? What's troubling you, my boy? He tried, straight to the point, no room for confusion. It's nothing. This whole investigation is getting to me. It'll be over eventually. There's nothing to do about it. I should get to lunch. Sorry, All Might. Midoriya dismissed himself quickly and didn't spare a second for Toshinori to press. Damn it. He shouldn't have rushed in like that. Midoriya was acting off. He looked so sad and distant, and it was pretty obvious that something had happened if you knew him well enough. Hitoshi couldn't say with confidence that he knew Midoriya well, but he knew him well enough to know that there were hidden depths to him that he would never let see the light of day. He tended to hide things away, his emotions more than anything, but even Todoroki had noticed something was off. Midoriya had been stopped by All Might in the hall and told them he'd meet them at the table, but everyone had gotten their food already and he had yet to join them. Is Midoriya okay? Todoroki asked him privately with the full audience of everyone else at the table. Uraraka cringed a bit and glanced at each of them in turn. Yeah, I noticed he was a bit, I don't know, he's been quieter, she added her own concern. Yes, he seemed to be in a good mood when I spoke to him Thursday evening, but ever since, he seemed rather tired. Ida threw in his 2 cents, and now everyone was looking at him and expecting an answer. Terrific. I don't know. He hasn't talked to me any more than he's talked to you guys, but you're right. Something seems off. He doesn't really like to talk about that kind of stuff too much. I don't know if it would be a good idea to ask him or not. It might be good to let him know we're thinking about him, but it might also make him feel worse. Hitoshi answered honestly. That's a good point, Uraraka replied solemnly. The table shared a moment of contemplative silence before she spoke up again. Maybe if only one of us asked, it would be like the best of both worlds, she suggested tentatively, with an expectant glance toward him, which he did not miss. He's not sure how he felt about being the group's Midoriya whisperer. Sure, he knew the most about what was going on with him, but he wasn't any better with talking about feelings than Midoriya himself. Uraraka should be the one to do this. This whole group was incredibly emotionally stunted aside from her. Yeah, that. He trailed off and sighed before accepting his fate. Yeah, okay, I'll do it. Izuku was going to crawl out of his own skin. Everything felt like it had been shifted 2 inches to the right, and it left him completely off kilter. He was angry and sad and so damn confused about hearing that his father was dead. He felt like he was going to lose his mind if he spent another second alone with his thoughts. So when Shinso asked if he wanted to come over and test his newly refined Mario Karting skills, he agreed before he even remembered that he needed to ask Eraser if that was okay. It felt like a stupid thing to have to do, but like most things nowadays, it was out of his hands. He had felt bad when he lied to Uraraka and told her he wasn't taking the train with her anymore because his mom had gotten a new job, but he was glad to see that apparently she'd been riding with Shinso these days. The three of them were sitting together now, and it was so nice to be around them. like the smallest bit of weight had fallen off his shoulders. Do you think your mom would mind Uraraka coming too? He asked. The question had been aimed at Shinso, but Uraraka was the one to answer. Oh, I've got too much homework to do. I've been putting it off, and I really need to get it done tonight. Plus, I don't think the TV would survive us playing each other again. She joked, but something in her tone felt a little off. She was lying about something, but Izuku supposed he wasn't in the position to criticize that kind of thing, so he let it go. If she didn't want to hang out with them, then that was fine. They bid her farewell when they got off at Shinso's stop, and she smiled pleasantly at them like she always did. Izuku didn't know what to make of that, so he did his best to push the subject from his mind. It was a nice day out, which was a much better thing to devote his attention toward. Shinso was blabbing on about the book he was currently reading like he had a tendency to do when he didn't know what else to say. He was nervous about something. What were they keeping from him? Was it the same thing, or did they both have things they were hiding? It's a nice day, Izuku. The sun is out. There are more pleasant things to focus on. Their business is their business. That's enough about a book you're never going to read. It's not even really that good anyways. Shinso trailed off. Izuku huffed out a small laugh to show that he had been listening. Companionable silence had never seemed to bother Shinso in the past, so he didn't feel the need to fill it as they walked. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before Shinso broke the silence himself. Are you all right? Shinso asked, like he was talking about the weather, nonchalant as anything. Yeah! This was supposed to be about literally anything else besides how he was doing. He felt misplaced anger flare up in his chest, but he tamped it down quickly. Well, at least he knew what they were conspiring about now. A covert wellness check. No. He found himself answering honestly despite his inclination to do the opposite. Shinso seemed just as surprised by his candor as he was if the double take he did was anything to go by. Did you, did something happen? He asked awkwardly after he recovered from the initial shock. First All Might, and now his friends? He was losing his touch with keeping everything under wraps, or maybe people never looked close enough to notice before. Have I been... Is it that obvious? He answered with another question, ignoring what Shinso asked entirely. No, well, yes, at least for people that know you. Ida just thought you seemed tired, and Uraraka said you'd been quiet. You haven't been, like, exuding a depressive aura, if that's what you're worried about. Shinso answered. They walked in silence for a while after that. Izuku didn't know what to say, and it seemed that Shinso didn't either. We're taking a detour. This seems like a gently swinging at an empty park kind of conversation. You need the ambiance or it won't work. Shinso spoke up as a park came into view. It won't work? He repeated with a raised brow. Yeah, trust the process, Greenie. Shinso confirmed as they walked off the sidewalk and onto the mulch surrounding the playground they were passing by. Shinso slung his backpack off his shoulders and set it down against one of the poles holding the set of two swings up. Izuku didn't really know what he was on about, but he followed his lead. They sat on the creaky swings and watched cars or the odd jogger pass by the park's entrance for a few minutes. So, what happened? Shinso asked again. I'm not sure. This weird guy brought me to a secluded park and made me sit here in silence for quote-unquote ambience. He answered coyly. You're insufferable. Shinso deadpanned back at him. You asked. he insisted with a laugh. Shinso rolled his eyes, but couldn't quite hide the smirk on his face, which turned into a chuckle when he realized he couldn't hold it in. The levity didn't last for long, though. After a moment, the ambience settled back in. He had been stewing in his own thoughts for the past 4 days now. Maybe it would help to let it out. He already felt better for having just admitted that he wasn't doing all right. Plus, Shinso asked in the first place. It wasn't like he was pushing this all on him a purpose of nothing, right? Maybe it was okay. My dad's dead, he admitted quietly. He heard Shinso's sharp intake of breath, but he couldn't bring himself to see whatever emotion was etched onto his face. He knew he should probably wait to see if Shinso wanted to hear the rest of it. That news was already a lot. He shouldn't just word vomit everything he had been keeping in. But it was like a dam had burst, and nothing could stop the shaky rant from leaving his mouth. I haven't seen him in nearly a decade, and he he was a terrible person. I don't understand why I'm so. I don't even know. He hurt me. I shouldn't be glad that he trailed off, realizing what he said too late. That was more than he wanted to reveal to anyone. He was still your dad, though. Shinso tried to insist, but Izuku interrupted him. No, he wasn't. He was just some guy that hated me. He was never. He cut himself off before he could say too much again. He took a deep breath or two and let silence fall over the park. The sound of birds chirping from the bushes, the distant traffic, and the high-pitched screeching of the swings made enough noise on their own. He didn't need to add to it. He took a moment to think about what he was even trying to get at before he spoke again. Angry. I'm angry that he's dead, he decided. Because you'll never get the chance to shove your success in his face? Shinso guessed. He huffed out a laugh at that, but he didn't disagree. That seems shallow, he observed. It seems natural. I'd feel the same way. You didn't get any closure or whatever. Closure? He hadn't been expecting closure in the first place. He hadn't really expected or wanted to see Hisashi ever again. Maybe Shinso was right. Maybe some part of him had wanted Hisashi to have seen him in the sports festival. Some part of him wanted to have proven that he wasn't a useless null. Not anymore. And even if he was, even if he had never gotten one for all, he still fought Todoroki quirkless. He still patrolled Uptown quirkless. He was still worth something, right? Aside from all of that, there was another part of himself buried as deep as he could manage that was angry that Hisashi wasn't alive to suffer anymore. Some sick, vindictive part of him wanted that man to hurt as much as he had hurt Izuku. He wanted him to still be an addict searching desperately for another hit and living most of his life in the worst stages of withdrawal. He wanted him to be shivering in the cold and eating out of the trash like Izuku had done for years. He wanted Hisashi to be miserable. And what did that say about him? Maybe he was his father's son after all. Doria, can you hear me? Shinso's voice broke through his perverse reverie. Yeah, sorry. What was that about? Shinso asked cautiously. Not for the first time, Izuku was tempted to completely spill his guts to Shinso. Hell, to anyone. He wanted to lay it all out on the table and beg them to say that it wasn't his fault, that he didn't deserve it. He wanted someone to take all of this shit out of his hands and tell him that they would take care of it and he could rest now. He was so damn tired, And the more that things changed for the better, the more they changed for the worse. Do you do you think I'm a bad person? He allowed himself to ask. Are you serious? Shinso replied incredulously. He shouldn't have asked. He knew better than to think other people would. No, Midoriya, what the hell? No, you're not a bad person. Shinso swiftly cut off his spiraling with such conviction that he couldn't stop himself from checking that the emotion wasn't just a trick in his tone. His face looked just as sure as his voice was. He had stopped swinging, sat up straight, and looked Izuku directly in the eyes. You are the most selfless person I've ever met. You saved my life when I was too busy being mad at you for being homeless, Shinso argued. You didn't know. That's exactly my point. You never blamed me at all, even when I was being a complete dick to you. Why would you even think that? Because you're not mourning your abuser properly? I'm not mourning him at all, he rebutted under his breath. What? Shinso asked, even though Izuku was pretty sure he had heard him. Was he really going to say this? I'm not upset that he's dead. I'm upset that he's not alive to suffer more, he said with all the vitriol he felt. He watched Shinso's face pale at his words. He watched as he realized that Izuku was far more depraved than he had thought. He watched as Shinso's expression twisted in disgust when his brain finally processed what Izuku had said. Why did he keep trying to drive Shinso away? Was it self-destruction or concern for who Shinso kept company with? Given what he just said, he assumed it was the former. He clearly wasn't so altruistic. What did he do to you? Shinso asked, revulsion evident in his tone. Sorry, apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I guess. He stammered and folded in on himself like a coward. At least his father had the spine to stand behind his principles. Midoriya, stop that. You are not your father. I shouldn't have asked that. I didn't mean it like, what could he have possibly done to have deserved that reaction? I meant it like, how horrible was he to have pushed you that far? Shinso clarified. Izuku didn't have anything to say to that. Shinso didn't really want the answer to that question, even if he thought he did. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I mean, obviously you don't have to, but if you think it might help, well, I'm not exactly a stranger to violent and or tragic backstories. My mom told me that she told you what happened to my dad, or at least part of it. I saw the whole thing, and I was at the USJ too. I'm not trying to compare you're not going to scare me away, is what I mean. Shinso fumbled out inelegantly. He searched his face for a moment, hunting for any hint of insincerity, but he didn't find any. He was a deadbeat and a drunk, an angry drunk, and I was an easy target. Izuku hesitated before he finished that statement. This wasn't something he could take back. But the concerned and angry look in Shinso's eyes pressed him forward. He had a fire quirk, and he liked to use it. He looked down as he spoke and left his statement open-ended. Shinso could fill in the blanks on his own. He could feel Shinso's gaze on the side of his face, but he couldn't bring himself to look at the expression he wore. He just kept looking down at his shoes and lightly kicking the wood chips beneath him. It felt like they sat there long enough that the sun should have gone down by now, but logically he knew it could only have been a few minutes, at most, before Shinso responded. I completely and totally agree with you. he stated in a voice that sounded distant but still rang heavy with the conviction that it had earlier. Izuku finally met his gaze with a raised brow. He was at this point fairly well versed in Shinso's angry expressions, but he had never seen one quite so violent as the one currently gracing his face. He should still be alive so that he can suffer. His existence makes me want to believe in a god so that I can find solace in the idea that he's boiling in a pit of sulfur for eternity, Shinso explained with even more ire than Izuku had. That was graphic, and unless Shinso had been taking acting lessons behind his back, then it was pretty plain to see that he meant what he had said with every fiber of his being. Izuku didn't know how to feel about that. As it was, he was staring back at Shinso with wide eyes and his mouth pressed firmly shut so as not to be gaping like a fish. If you're a bad person for thinking that, then so am I, Shinso continued when Izuku failed to respond. Shinso wasn't a bad person. Izuku knew that like he knew the sun rose in the east and set in the west. Shinso was one of the best people he had ever met. So either he was a terrible judge of character, or maybe Shinso was right. My mom's going to start getting worried. Should I text her that we stopped for a bit, or do you want to keep walking? Shinso asked. No, we can go, he replied shakily. Thankfully, Shinso took him at his word and not at his tone because he wasted no time scooping up his backpack and continuing on their way. They took turns wordlessly kicking a particularly large wood chip down the sidewalk until Shinso managed to kick it into the gutter and it fell through the grate. Maybe it would find a new life as a tiny bit of beechwood. It was a shame, though, because it had been distracting him from the fact that Shinso clearly had something he wanted to say. Now that they had nothing else to do, he seemed to be gearing up to say it. Is, does your name bother you? Midoriya, I mean, because it's, well, the family name, not exactly good memories, I guess. Shinso finally spoke up hesitantly. That was something he hadn't actually thought of before. Midoriya was technically the family name, but they had never really been a family. No one in his memory had ever referred to them as the Midoriyas. He had never felt much affection for his father, and his mother had been distant for so long that she was hardly any closer to him in his mind than his father had been. He didn't have a family. He was his only family. His mother and father just happened to share the same last name. So, no, the name Midoriya didn't really bother him. He'd been called much worse, after all. I've been just me for so long that I know it. They aren't my family. I'm just me. What else would I go by anyway? He asked. It's not like he was going to take Eraser's last name. Instead, Mike didn't even take Eraser's name. Plus, they weren't even adopting him. He was just there. Izuku? Shinso answered in a lovingly condescending tone, like he was a bit of a dumbass for asking the question to begin with. Oh, that was... Yeah, okay, maybe it was a bit of a dumbass for asking that, but Izuku didn't really feel right either. He didn't know who Izuku was. He was still trying to figure that out. He couldn't imagine introducing himself as Izuku to anyone. Don't want strangers calling me by my given name. It feels wrong, he replied. Well, we're not strangers. I'm pretty sure most friends of going on 3 years, however non-contiguous, would normally be on a first name basis by now, Shinso clarified. Oh, No one had called him by his given name since, well, it was better not to dwell on that. Did he want that? To open himself up like that again? It felt like more than just a metaphor. It felt like a leap of faith. But the sun rose in the east and set in the west. Shinso was a good person. Izuku had more faith in that than he did in most things. Yeah, okay, yeah. He agreed hesitantly. All right, Izuku, then you can call me Hitoshi, or Toshi, as my mom calls me that. No one else has ever. Well, that's not important. Call me whatever you want to call me, Shinso answered. Whatever I want? He repeated with a shit-eating grin. Nope, no, I take that back immediately. Hitoshi and Toshi are the only options. Hitoshi quickly corrected himself. They laughed as they walked, and Izuku kept coming up with increasingly terrible nicknames, all of which Hitoshi emphatically denied permission to use. When they made it back to Hitoshi's house, Shinso-san greeted them each with a bone-crushing hug. This felt right. This felt like what family was supposed to be. End of chapter.